Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the International Whaling Commission. That's the IWC. You've given us some really interesting stuff to work with here. A presentation about the IWC and some things from their website, and also a research review. Oh, and something about special permits too. So it's interesting. What do you think? Ready to kind of uncover the IWC's history and how they went from like managing whaling to focusing on conservation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's really a fascinating story, like how they've had to adapt over the years, and how our whole understanding of conservation has kind of changed too.
For sure. I mean, when you think about it, whaling is kind of the perfect example of how we as humans really mess up when it comes to natural resources, right? Like over whaling. That wipes out populations. We've known that forever.
Yep. It's true. It's kind of sad. And, even way back when, they tried to regulate whaling. Like in 1931, there was this convention, the Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. They tried to prohibit the killing of certain species, and they also wanted to make sure people used the whole whale, like not just waste parts of it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it didn't really work, did it? I mean, major whaling nations like Japan and the USSR, they didn't exactly follow the rules.
Nope, not really. Which kind of shows, I guess, the problem that still exists even today, getting everyone on board, agreeing to do things a certain way. But then, in 1946, things started to really change. That's when we got the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, and that's the convention that created the IWC.
Okay, so now this is where things get kind of interesting, because the preamble to the convention, that's all about saving whales for future generations, but it also talks about like keeping whale stocks at a certain level, an optimum level they call it, so it doesn't hurt the whaling industry. So was it really about conservation, or was it just a way to keep the industry going?
It's a really good question, and I think it kind of gets to the heart of the IWC's history. It might have been, well, maybe a little of both. I think that tension between conservation and making money, that's always been there. It's kind of shaped the IWC from the very beginning.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did they try to make this work? Like, how was the convention supposed to actually like do stuff? What were the main parts of it?
Well, one of the things they did was create something called the schedule. And that basically sets the rules for whaling, like the catch limits and which species are protected. It's like the rule book, But there's also something called Article 8. And that's the one that lets countries give special permits for, get this, scientific whaling. And that's been, well, let's just say it's been controversial.
The old scientific whaling loophole. We'll have to definitely come back to that. But first, I'm curious, how does the IWC actually work? Like, what's the structure of it?
Okay, so basically there are 6 main committees. They cover things like conservation, scientific research, finances, Aboriginal subsistence whaling, stuff like that. And then each of those committees, they have these subgroups, and they focus on very specific tasks or like research areas.
So it's pretty complex. Well, I guess it has to be.
Right.
They're trying to manage whaling all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. But that global reach, that creates its own set of problems. Like the IWC, they have authority over all the waters, like the high seas, territorial seas, even something called EEZs. Those are exclusive economic zones, but that overlaps with something called UNECLS. That's the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. And that basically says that each country has the right to manage, the resources in their own EEZ.
Oh, so that's tricky. You got the IWC trying to manage the whales everywhere, but then each country has their own rules for their own waters.
Exactly. It gets kind of messy, right? With like who has the authority. And that can cause some, conflicts. And to make it even more complicated, it's not really clear if the IWC has authority over all the smaller cetaceans, like dolphins and porpoises, for example.
So are those considered whales or not?
Yeah, that's the debate. The IWC, they have this thing called the Annex, and it lists all the whale species. So some countries say, hey, that's all the IWC can manage, just the whales on that list. But others say, no, the Annex is just a list. It doesn't limit what the IWC can do. They can manage all cetaceans.
So even just figuring out what the IWC is supposed to be managing, that's a huge problem. How do you get countries to work together when they can't even agree on that?
Yeah, it definitely makes things harder. And it's just one of the many problems the IWC has to deal with.
Okay, we'll get to those in just a bit. But first, let's talk about one of the most important things that happened with the IWC. Back in 1982, there was a moratorium on commercial whaling.
Yeah, that was huge. I mean, it basically banned commercial whaling in most of the oceans.
I bet the whales were happy about that. But not everyone, right?
Yeah, you're right. Some countries, like Norway and Iceland and Russia, they weren't too pleased. They filed objections and kept whaling. But they had to follow certain rules. like catch limits and reporting their catches to the IWC. And then eventually Japan, they just left the IWC altogether in 2019. And now they're back to commercial whaling.
So even with the moratorium, some whaling still goes on. And I'm guessing this is where those special permits for scientific research come in.
Yep, you got it. That's where the controversy lies. Remember that Article 8? That's the one that gives each country the power to give out those permits. The IWC itself, they don't control them.
Which leads to situations like what happened with Australia and Japan,
Yeah.
right? Didn't they end up in court over Japan's whaling?
They sure did. Australia, they took Japan to the ICJ, that's the International Court of Justice, over a whaling program that Japan had. It was called JARPATHER, and it was happening in the Antarctic. Australia's argument was basically, this isn't really for science. You could do this without killing whales.
And what did the court say?
Well, they sided with Australia. They said JARPASEC was not for science, so they had to stop the program.
Wow, that's a big deal. So that stopped Japan's whaling, right?
Well, not really. See, they stopped JARPA 2, but then they started up NUREP-A and NUREP-NP. They kept doing research in the Antarctic and the North Pacific, so that, of course, started the whole debate up again within the IWC.
So it seems like it's this constant back and forth between the people who want to protect the whales and the people who want to keep whaling, even if they say it's for science.
Yep, that about sums it up. That's kind of the story of the IWC, really.
And this kind of brings us back to all those challenges you mentioned earlier. Sounds like they got their work cut out for them.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. We've talked about some of them already, like who has authority where and which species they're even supposed to be managing, and then all the controversy around that scientific whaling. But those are just the beginning.
Okay, so lay it on me. What other problems are they dealing with?
Well, there's this thing called pirate whaling, and that's basically when you have these ships flying the flag of a country that's not part of the IWC, so they don't have to follow any of the rules.
Oh, wow. So there's no way to control them. Like it's a free-for-all out there.
It's a huge problem. The IWC, they've been trying to get member countries to stop, selling ships to these non-member countries or sharing whaling knowledge, but it's really hard to enforce.
Yeah, I bet. I bet organizations like Greenpeace are really important in, like, keeping an eye on this
Oh,
stuff.
totally. They're like the watchdogs, right?
I could-
Exposing illegal whaling and putting pressure on governments to do something.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we got these jurisdiction issues and the debate over which species they even cover, the whole scientific whaling thing,
Yeah.
and now these rogue whalers who just do whatever they want. What else?
So the IWC also has to deal with all these other international agreements. Sometimes those agreements, they help the IWC do its job, but sometimes they can kind of overlap or even conflict.
Oh, really? Like,
Yeah.
what? Can you give me an example?
Sure. There's sea heights. That's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And most of the cetaceans, they're listed under Sea Sites Appendix Way, which basically means you can't trade them internationally.
Right, that makes sense. If you're trying to protect them, you don't want people buying and selling them all over the place.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Iceland and Japan and Norway, they don't agree with that. They filed something called reservations against those sea heights listings. So they don't think there should be a trade ban. Which kind of shows that even when you have these international agreements, some countries, they still do their own thing.
Yeah, it sounds like a real balancing act. Are there any other agreements like that the IWC has to work around?
Oh, yeah, there are a few, like the Berne Convention. That's mostly about protecting cetaceans and their habitats in Europe. And then you have the European Union. They have their own regulations, like they ban imports of whale products. And they have rules about fishing gear to try and stop whales from getting caught accidentally.
So those are more kind of regional agreements. But they still affect what the IWC can do.
Yep, exactly. And then you have agreements that are about specific regions or ecosystems, like there's CCMLR, that stands for the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. That's a mouthful. But basically, they manage the krill fishery down in the Southern Ocean.
Krill. Why is that important for the IWC?
Because krill is like the main food source for a lot of whales. So the IWC and CCMLR, they have to work together to make sure the krill fishing is sustainable.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't hurt the whales.
Oh, I see. So it's all connected. It's not just about the whales themselves, but the whole, ecosystem.
Exactly. And I think the IWC, they're starting to really get that. They're not just focusing on whaling anymore. They're looking at a bunch of different conservation issues, like climate change, marine debris, ship strikes, all that stuff.
So it's a more well-rounded approach.
Yeah.
Like they realize whales are facing all these threats from all different directions.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it, and that's definitely a good thing. I mean, take climate change, for example. The IWC, they've been saying that it's a big threat to whales, like the warming water, ocean acidification, and how that can change, where the whale's food is.
Yeah, those are huge problems. So what can they even do about that?
Well, they've been having workshops to figure out how climate change is impacting whales. And they're trying to get all the member countries to do something about it, like reduce emissions and stuff. And they want countries to think about climate change when they're making their conservation plans.
So they're raising awareness.
Yeah.
And advocating for changes.
Mm.
And trying to get everyone on board.
Exactly. And it's not just climate change. They're also working on the whole marine debris problem. All that plastic in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big problem for whales. They can get tangled up in fishing nets, or they eat the plastic. And that can kill them.
Yeah, it's really sad. What are they doing about that?
Well, they've been having workshops to figure out how to reduce the amount of debris. And they're saying that countries need to work together to fix the root of the problem, like using less plastic and figuring out better ways to manage waste.
So they're looking at the impact on whales.
Yeah.
But also the bigger picture, like why it's happening in the first place.
Yep, exactly. And they're also trying to reduce the risk of ship strikes, because there are more and more ships out there all the time. And that means more chances for whales to get hit.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. More ships, more whales getting hit.
Right. So the IWC, they've been working with the IMO, that's the International Maritime Organization, to try and find solutions, like changing the shipping routes or making ships go slower in certain areas. They're even trying to use technology to, detect whales and avoid them.
Wow, so they're really trying to be proactive.
Yeah.
And find ways to prevent these problems.
They really are. And I think that's a good sign. This whole shift to a more, comprehensive way of thinking about conservation, they're realizing that it's not just about whales, it's about the whole ocean.
Yeah, like the whale's fate is tied to the fate of the ocean.
Exactly. And that leads to some really big questions about how we manage wildlife, on a global scale, I mean.
Like what kinds of questions?
Well, how do you balance, saving the whales with, economic interest? How do you enforce these agreements when you're dealing with, the ocean? It's not like it belongs to anyone. And how do we keep up with new threats and new scientific discoveries?
Yeah, those are really big questions. I bet there's no easy answers.
Nope, not at all. But I think it's important that the IWC is even thinking about these things. It means they're willing to change and adapt.
So even with all the challenges and the controversies, there's still hope for the IWC and for the whales.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's not over yet. The IWC still has a lot to figure out. And there's always pressure from countries that don't want to protect whales. But they are trying. And they are changing. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, me too. And I think it shows that we all have to do our part, use less plastic, think about where your seafood comes from, and just spread the word about why whales are important.
Absolutely. The whale's future is our future too, in a way.
So to kind of wrap up our deep dive into the IWC, I want to leave you with this thought. The IWC, it might not be perfect, but it shows that we're at least trying to manage something that belongs to everyone, trying to protect these amazing animals, and trying to find that balance between what we need as humans and what the planet needs.
It's definitely a story that's not finished yet. We're still figuring it out.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the IWC. Hope you learned some stuff and maybe even feel a little bit inspired. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.